During the Second World War, the aircraft carrier emerged as the undisputed capital ship, with a potency far beyond that of any battleship. This was demonstrated many times during the fightback across the Pacific, during which the US Navy was joined by British carriers. The war years also showed the importance of amphibious operations in regaining territory and taking the fight to the enemy. The roles of the aircraft carrier and of amphibious operations were to become much closer in the years after the Second World War. Thus, Britain's Fleet Air Arm expected to play a major part in maintaining the peace in the years that followed.
Since 1945, the Royal Navy has been involved in more than 60 activities where carrier-borne aircraft have taken part. In some of those, they're largely forgotten because no shot was fired, but that's the whole point of deterrence. If by merely putting a carrier off the coast and flying over the land, you can get the other guy to say, maybe I won't, then you've proved it. The first jet had landed on a carrier, another British first, in December 1945. A Sea Vampire landed on HMS Ocean. And there were enormous worries that not only might it prove extremely difficult to operate jets from a carrier, but since there was no capacity for refining jet fuel in Britain, that we would be reliant on the United States for fuel, and we didn't have the dollars to pay for it. And there were quite a few bomber lobbyists who said that now atomic weapons were the way forward. They'd rendered all other forms of warfare obsolete. Well, yet again, they were slightly ahead of themselves. So there were genuine fears in the late 1940s that it might prove physically impossible to operate the new generation of aircraft from carriers.
The Fleet Air Arm had no choice but to soldier on with piston power, whilst the RAF soared into the jet age. Post-war carrier decks were crammed with some of the most powerful piston-engined aircraft ever to fly. For example, the de Havilland Sea Hornet had a top speed of 466 miles per hour. The Blackburn Firebrand could deliver a torpedo at 350 miles per hour. The Westland Wyvern followed the Firebrand into service and was the world's first turboprop-powered combat aircraft. It was an enormous aircraft and was only in service for 5 years. But it was the Hawker Sea Fury and Fairey Firefly that went to war in Korea from 1950 to 1953. Here they carried out countless ground attack sorties, although Sea Furies did see air combat with Russian-built MiGs.
A lot of pilots got hardened real war, real situation training, and that lasted over the years for quite a long time as they went up through the ranks. And so they had a good appreciation of what a shooting war was like.
But new designs were taking shape that would take the Fleet Air Arm into the jet age. The first of these was the Supermarine Attacker. The Attacker had originally been offered to the RAF, who turned it down in favour of the Meteor and Vampire. Although the Attacker first flew in July 1946, it was not until June the following year that a navalised version was tested. In August 1951, Number 800 Squadron became the first of 4 squadrons to become operational with the Attacker.
Having had substantial experience on piston engine aircraft in the latter stages of the war and subsequently, the Attacker was undoubtedly a step forward, but at the same time it did have its limitations, and I suppose the greatest limitation for deck operations was that it had a tail wheel, which was totally unsuitable really for moving it on the deck and even for taxiing ashore. I remember my first solo flight in an Attacker, and I had enormous difficulty in taxiing it. And why it was designed with the tail wheel I will never know, because all subsequent aircraft, jet aircraft, had nose wheels. But it was a pleasant enough aircraft to fly, but it wasn't a sufficient advance in jet technology, although it was very useful in that it was destined 800 and 803 squadrons, the first two attacker squadrons, to form the air group of Eagle for the first commission of Eagle, which was the largest carrier we'd ever had and a new class, and therefore it was a step forward in the operation of jet aircraft at sea, jet fighters at sea.
One of the difficult parts of transiting to jet aircraft coincided with a change of batsmen's signals after the war. The last time I flew before joining the attacker squadron was in the Seafire with British signals. And of course, by the time I came to fly jets again on a Carrier in 1952, the signals were almost exactly opposite to their meaning when I last flew. So I found that you had to double think in order to get that straight. The Attacker itself, a beautiful looking aircraft, very streamlined, very light on the ailerons, very heavy on the elevators in the looping plane. Not really a good fighter compared with others in the world, the MiGs and the Sabres, but we were thrilled to be there. Deck landing was better than the Seafire, of course, because you had a marvellous view. But of course, you didn't have a tricycle undercarriage. And furthermore, on a straight deck, we had to change to nylon barriers. And it was like coming to land with a string of washing out in front of you. But within its limitations, we learned a great deal about high altitude flying and interceptions and all the details of air-to-air firing. Ground attack, it was an average aircraft, I would say, for ground attack.
Well, on the flight deck, you had to use an awful lot of thrust to get the aircraft moving, which meant the flight deck of an aircraft carrier is a very hazardous place anyway. And when you are using lots of thrust to move an aircraft, you've got to watch where you're pointing. And so it became an even more hazardous place. And of course, intakes. Jet intakes have a strong suction factor, and so you've got to make certain there are no loose articles or loose persons walking anywhere near the intake. So it was a lesson learned very quickly that it was a hazard that had to be faced up with and dealt with on an hour-to-hour daily basis.
Although it wasn't a great aircraft, of course, it was very difficult to maintain. And in fact, my following appointment, I was the commanding officer of a training squadron in attackers. That was just converting people to jet aircraft, and I'm afraid we did most of the conversion on the Meteor aircraft we had. The attackers were so difficult to maintain.
The main thing was that all the difficulties of operating jets at sea were put into practice, and the lessons were learnt. The slow acceleration of a jet engine, the vast closing speed on approach to land, the shortage of endurance with a jet engine, it had to be taken into account, and drills had to be very sharp and smart, and deadlines stuck to rigidly. All those things were learnt for the first time the hard way. And in that respect, the Attacker and Eagle in the first commission were a distinct step forward.
The Attacker was replaced by the de Havilland Sea Venom in 1954. Although similar in appearance to the Vampire, it was a completely fresh design. The most noticeable difference was the shape of the wing, but it also had a more powerful de Havilland Ghost engine. In 1953, the design was modified to accommodate a second crew member and extra radar equipment. In this guise, it proved a success in the night fighter role. Although primarily a fighter, like all Fleet Aerion aircraft, it had to be able to carry out a variety of roles. Thus, it could also carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 3-inch rockets mounted on hardpoints under its wings. In In 1955, the Ark Royal was commissioned into service. As well as being the Navy's most modern carrier, she also carried the Fleet Air Arm's latest jet fighters, the Hawker Seahawk. The Seahawk was Hawker's first jet design, begun as a private venture. Unfortunately, the RAF was not interested, but the Admiralty were. It had a development of the Rolls-Royce Nene engine, similar to the unit in the Attacker, although a larger fuel tank meant that the Seahawk had a better endurance. It also had similar armament of 4 20mm cannons, as well as an ability to carry bombs and rockets. But the main improvement was that it had a tricycle undercarriage.
I think fundamentally the Seahawk was a naval aircraft. It was well suited to deck operations.
Well, the Seahawk had a tricycle undercarriage to start with, so it's easier to handle on the deck. Had a marvellous view, and it was a beautiful aircraft to fly, and a rather forgiving aircraft, rather easy aircraft to fly. Once again, not in the top class as a fighter, but we all loved flying it.
It was very easy to fly, and very easy to deck land, and very adaptable to a number of roles, ground attack, air-to-air, and so on. And it was a positive delight. It was reasonable to maintain. It was easier to maintain than the Attacker.
The difference between deck landing a Seahawk and a Seafury was vast. A Seahawk was amazingly easy to deck land, because you could see what you were doing all the way in.
But in 1956, the Fleet Air Arm found itself going into battle once more, this time in Suez. In July, the Egyptian President Colonel Nasser nationalized the Anglo-French company that built and ran the Suez Canal, a vital shipping lane between the West and East. An Anglo-French task force set sail in August with the aim of taking back control of the canal. To complicate matters further, Israeli forces crossed their border and were soon within 20 miles of the canal zone. In the face of intense international pressure led by the United States, the Anglo-French force, including the Fleet Air Arm, prepared to attack.
The pattern in those days, just before Suez, was to have an 18-month cycle whereby you had 6 months work up, then you had a year operational, mostly at sea, and then the squadron disbanded and you started again. And that meant that most squadrons started with about 10 of their 14 pilots who were all ab initio, the first squadron that they'd served in. So when we went to Suez, most of them only had 6 months flying under their belts. And some of them, in fact, had not fired a rocket. And my own squadron changed aircraft with 895 Squadron just before Suez to FGA-6s, which also carried rockets. And we spent the last 3 days before the actual operation training people to fire their rockets. None of us were absolutely certain who we might fight. We knew for about 5 or 6 months that there may be some sort of action going on off Suez. We weren't certain as time drew nearer who it was we were going to fight. We all thought it was the Egyptians, but we weren't sure. And 3 days before the first actions, the commanding officers were told that it was Egypt that was our target. But we weren't allowed to tell the squadron members until the day before. We were taking off at first light the next day in our first section.
We were told the night before by the Chief of Staff to the Admiral on board that we were going to war the next day. And he said, don't ask me who we're going to fight, because if I don't know, he said, I'm not clear whether we're fighting against the Israelis, the Egyptians, or what. Or how the French are involved as well, and the American fleet is also in the area. So he said it's rather a confused picture.
One felt then there are a lot of things that the young pilots didn't know. Minor things such as weaving. If you're flying low in amongst that, you must never fly straight and level. We all learned that during the war and in Korea. But of course, in day-to-day training, peacetime, you don't think of that until you're faced with the problem.
You'd be absolutely crazy to make 2 passes, because the first pass, you've got an element of surprise. The second pass, the radar-controlled gunners on the ground have got time to stub out their fags, put their cup of tea down, and wait for you coming in again. So you learned in Korea that you didn't make 2 passes, and that if you had to make another pass, you came back 15 or more minutes later from a different direction. So you tried to maintain the element of surprise.
There was a lot of propaganda going on about the type of aircraft that the Egyptians had. MiGs were better than the Sea Hawk. We weren't sure whether there were going to be any Russian pilots there. We were told there may be. And we were told that the targets were heavily defended.
We had 4 aircraft carriers there at the time. The targets were all military, except for Cairo Radio, which was taken off the air for a day or 2. Again, our targets were ammunition dumps, were airfields, aircraft on those airfields.
Anyone that had fought in the World War or Korea, it was rather weird and disconcerting because not all the targets responded, and you felt as though it wasn't really a war. And sometimes you could fire at a target and you weren't sure whether they were soldiers or civilians or whatever. In fact, on one occasion we went back and reported this, and the Admiral stopped us shooting at soft-skinned vehicles.
We were then given a target, which I couldn't believe, which was a place called the Governorate. And General Stockwell said, I think that must be their headquarters. Tell those Seahawks up there to go for the Governorate. So I've never had a target that big before. It's a fact of life that if you relax and say, oh, it's an easy target, you'll probably miss it even though it's that big. So what we actually did was I told the rest of my flight that you will take that window, you will take that one, I will take the front door, and so on. And we had 60-pound rockets on at the time, and every single rocket hit the Governorate except one. And after, I gather what happened inside the Governorate was because of all these rockets hitting it at either end and in the middle, that the different floors started collapsing one on the other. And there were chaps jumping out of windows all over the place. And when we landed back on board, about half an hour later, the word came through that the Egyptians were wanting to talk.
The carriers really destroyed the Egyptian airfield. The Royal Air Force played their part, but were not equipped with aircraft with long enough range. And the carriers were able to get within 50 miles of the coast, and you could reach almost anywhere in Egypt. So from that point of view, it was a very successful operation. We did what we were told to do. Now, had the Egyptians fought, and Nasser told most of his pilots to stand down, he didn't want to risk them, it might have been a very different operation. But as it was, they didn't choose to fight.
But it was all to end in humiliation for the British and the French. Behind the scenes, an enraged US was able to exert enough pressure to force a climb down. The Anglo-French forces were withdrawn to be replaced by one acting on behalf of the United Nations. Anglo-US relations have rarely sunk so low.
you didn't feel very well supported by your own politicians. I mean, I heard a story of a man somewhere over in Essex who was watching his television, and I think Mr. Gateskill was on there saying, oh, we shouldn't be there, and so on. And he got so infuriated, he went and got his shotgun and emptied both barrels into the television set. But one did feel, yes, that the politicians, I thought, were behaving very badly in that you had a situation, you were committed to a warlike situation, and at that point, I think, is the right time that one should all get behind your servicemen and everyone involved to give them some sort of support. And in the Suez campaign, that was certainly not coming from Edith Summersgill and Gateskill and people like that.
Meanwhile, new designs were being developed. Although the Attacker could only be described as a qualified success, Supermarine persevered with even more unusual designs. The Type 508 was a development of an earlier type which was intended to belly land on a flexible deck. Extraordinary though the concept may seem, it did gain some currency. The new generation of jets were not only faster, but they weighed more. Dispensing with the undercarriage was one way of saving weight. The 508 was given an undercarriage and flown out to begin deck trials on HMS Eagle. The design was subsequently developed until it crystallized as the Type 544 in 1956. Renamed the Scimitar, the first production aircraft for the Fleet Air Arm flew in early 1957. The following year, the Scimitar became operational with number 803 Squadron.
It was an airborne sports car to fly with a huge amount of power. The Americans said only the Brits could build an aeroplane with that amount of power and keep it subsonic.
You could fly this along, minding your own business, just above the ground, sort of where you shouldn't have been. You should have been a little bit higher. You could look up and see a jet contrail, and you think, I wonder what that is. Open the throttle, within seconds you'll be up there looking at this thing at the same height. The only trouble was when you were up there, the Scimitar didn't go around corners very well, but it would go down fast, it would go up fast, and it was, once you knew it, and once you knew what it was up to, it was good fun, very good fun.
It was quite daunting to see it for the first time and climb into the cockpit and see how big it was. That was my first impression. My second impression on flying it for the first time was the tremendous thrust you had on takeoff and a fantastic rate of climb. It really could climb very hard. But it was pleasant to fly, but very hard to maintain, very hard. And it was also incontinent. You would park it in the hangar overnight, and in the morning there would be puddles all over the place of fuel and God knows what else. But I don't think they ever solved the incontinency of a Scimitar. But it was a complicated airplane to maintain, compared, for instance, with a Hunter.
It had a number of roles, in fact. It was a fighter, first of all. It had 4 30mm cannon, which used to rattle the airplane considerably when you fired it, and they're right underneath your seat. And these things banging off again, bits of it used to fall off. So for practice, you never used the 4 cannons more than you needed to.
The challenges to start with were to try and use it as an interceptor fighter, which it was not really suited to. And the other thing was it was single-seater, it had no air intercept radar, so it was at the end of the gunfighter line.
Having said it was then a fighter airplane, it also had a ground attack capability and could drop bombs and fire rockets.
Well, it was a good ground attack aircraft. It was a stable gun and bomb and rocket platform, but I'm quite certain it wasn't designed as such, but it was certainly envisaged as such, and we trained as such, as to deliver a tactical nuclear weapon. And when 807 Squadron, which was the squadron I commanded, was the second to be formed, and we trained at Lossiemouth in low-level delivery of a tactical nuclear weapon. And this was something new. It was called the over-the-shoulder delivery system, and it was bizarre in many ways that you would run in at something approaching 600 knots at 50 feet above the sea or terrain, and then identify a pull-up point. Having no radar, this had to be done by eye, and going at 600 knots and picking out a prominent thing at 50 feet, it's not the easiest of things. So then you had to pull up into a loop and release the weapon at a timed point. And this would have the effect of throwing the weapon vertically into the air, and you would carry on to the first half of the loop and then roll out of the loop and dive away. And the theory was that the time that this evolution took would give time to you get clear of the nuclear blast, because in the meantime the bomb would be going upwards before it started coming down again, and you would be well clear of the nuclear blast.
Throughout the Cold War, NATO maintained the plan that an attack on the West in Europe would be countered by holding forces on the ground who would hold out until the American cavalry arrived across the Atlantic to relieve them. The role of the Western navies was to form a strike fleet, both to get that convoy of ships and the arsenal of the West to Europe, and to strike on the flanks of the Soviet attack. It was the wild card. They knew that both America and Britain could launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, where they would come from and broadly where they would go to. They knew where the bombers would take off and broadly where they would come. They didn't know where the carriers could launch their aircraft, from the Barents Sea or the Mediterranean. And I think it's an interesting complement to the power of the carrier when you look at the resource the Russians put into trying to stop them. Submarines, the largest submarine force in the world. It wasn't intended to be a commerce raiding force like the Germans, but it was to stop the carrier strike force. Cruisers with missiles, motor torpedo boats with missiles, they put a vast amount of effort. The Soviet Naval Air Force with its anti-ship missiles were all there to try and stop the West's strike fleet.
My understanding was it was totally separate from the V-Force plan, which was a strategic concept. Ours was entirely tactical, and it was to take out specific targets, not urban targets, but things like power stations and dockyards and things like that. And it would be on the land rather than over the sea. It would be a land target, but specific and tactical, not in any way integrated with the V-Force and their strategic plan.
During the 1960s, the Fleet Air Arm, like the RAF, became an all-jet service, in that all training was conducted in jet aircraft.
I joined the Navy in January 1963 and did 6 months at Dartmouth at the Naval College, and then started flying training that autumn in September with the Royal Air Force at Minton-on-Ouse. We did about a year with the Air Force, then went on to Royal Naval Air Station at Brawdy, did our advanced flying training and the operational flying training, the first part of it, and then on to Naval Air Station at Yeovilton, and where I did the conversion onto the Sea Vixen. So the whole process of flying training took about 2 years and occupied about 460 hours during that time. So it was a lot of flying in a relatively short timescale. We started with the Jet Provost at Minton-on-Ouse with the Royal Air Force. Having said that, we actually did a flying grading while we were at Dartmouth, where we weeded out those who weren't going to make it at all. And that was done on a Tiger Moth. So we did a sort of 10 or 12 hours on a Tiger Moth. And then it was Jet Provost at Linton-on-Ouse, and we did the two-seat Hunter, advanced flying training at Brawley, the single-seat Hunter for those going on to the fast jet types, and then the Sea Vixen.
The de Havilland Sea Vixen began life in 1946 to meet a requirement for an all-weather and night fighter. As the DH-110, it was in competition for the contract with Gloucester and what eventually became the Javelin. The Javelin flew first, and with that, interest in the DH-110 waned. But once again, the Royal Navy intervened, and a navalised version was developed. The first operational aircraft, designated FAW-1 Fighter All-Weather, entered service in 1957. At £35,000 when loaded, the Sea Vixen was the heaviest aircraft operated by the Fleet Air Arm up to that date. It was also its first missile-only fighter. Developed into a Mark II version with increased fuel capacity thanks to tanks housed in the twin booms, which now extended forward of the wing's leading edge. Today, one example still flies.
The Sea Vixen was primarily a fighter. It was an all-weather fighter, and so its principal role was to combat other aircraft, air defence of the fleet. It had a secondary role, which was reconnaissance. It had a strike role. It had a nuclear capable role, and it also did a wide variety of attack missions using dropping weapons of various sorts. 2-inch rockets it carried in pods, and a range of bombs. I can recall, I think the first reaction to the Sea Vixen was this enormous aeroplane, and it looked mean. It was it was big, and I think the first time I saw it was actually when one came up to Linton-on-Ouse, and one thought, could you really come to grips with this huge aeroplane? We were flying, relatively speaking, the Jet Provost was a very small aeroplane. Certainly the first flight at Yeovilton was quite something, because although we had a simulator, the first time you actually flew the aeroplane, you were in charge, you were driving it, and you had an observer in the observer's seat, not a pilot. And so it was the first time that you were actually flying an aeroplane that size, and more particularly, it was the first time you'd flown a twin-engined aeroplane. So there were all sorts of problems or complexities that you had to come to grips with. And it was very, very exciting. I remember that first flight in the Sea Vixen more, I think, than I remember my first solo flight in an aeroplane. The Sea Vixen was a very big aeroplane, and it had a huge wing. Actually, when you're flying it, of course, you're sitting way ahead of everything, so unless you really crane your neck around, you're not aware of the size of the aeroplane. It was reasonably heavy to fly, and that was probably a good thing, that you didn't overstress the aeroplane. And the huge wing, of course, enabled you to climb to very high altitudes and carry out turns that you really couldn't achieve that same sort of agility at altitude in the Phantom, which I went on to fly, and certainly not in the Sea Harrier, which, relatively speaking, had a much smaller wing.
I think one of the features of the Sea Vixen, it was very sloppy on the ailerons, and it's something that you don't need in a carrier jet when you're coming in close to your stalling speed, because you have to be. You need control, lateral control, and the Vixen was very sloppy to pick up a wing with you slightly offline at the end. And I witnessed 1 or 2 hairy events, but fortunately none disastrous.
Yes, the Sea Vixen was a big aeroplane, wingspan of over 40 feet. You were not really conscious of the size when you were flying it, but certainly on the deck you were conscious of a big aeroplane. But the first thing you did when you landed, of course, was to fold the wings, and that reduced the size to vastly less. And it was highly maneuverable. You had a good nose wheel steering system. It had fairly good brakes on the deck, and so actually maneuvering around the deck was not a problem, and very tightly controlled. The naval aircraft handlers, you were under their total control. The only authority you had was really to stop. Otherwise, the directions that you got were mandatory, and unlike other directions you get in an aircraft where they're advisory, you actually do what the handler tells you to do. And so there weren't problems with it. The launch from a carrier was exciting. I mean, the catapult launch in any airplane from a carrier is exciting. So long as you did everything that you were supposed to do and didn't try and rotate the aircraft too quickly. You had a very big wing, so that was developing a lot of lift, and so long as the engines were working, then things were happening reasonably slowly, and you had enough time. And indeed, those, thinking back, and I've seen a number of times when the launch process didn't work and people have had to eject. Generally speaking, there's been enough time for people to get out safely.
But entry into the jet age was costing the Fleet Air Arm dearly in pilots' lives. The combination of complex, bigger, heavier and faster jets operating on relatively small British carriers led to an unacceptable rise in accidents. For example, of the 76 Scimitars actually produced, over half were lost to accidents. The role of the Air Sea Rescue helicopter became of vital importance. Although the Dragonfly was the Navy's first British-built helicopter to enter service, it was in fact a Sikorsky S-51 built under license by Westlands. Whereas in the past, a destroyer kept station off the carrier's stern in case of emergencies, a helicopter could now carry out that role. And given that time is vital when recovering a ditched pilot, the helicopter was considerably quicker at getting to the scene. The number of accidents could only be reduced by a reappraisal of training methods.
I think it wasn't so much in the what came to be called the day fighter stream, which was the Attacker, Seahawk, Scimitar era, which we were largely employed during the day because we didn't carry radar, an essential ingredient for all-weather operations. The heavy loss rate in naval jet flying in the 50s was mainly in the all-weather fighter stream, which was the Sea Venom and the Sea Vixen. And we learnt the hard way. We did have an awful lot of fatal accidents at that time because we were flying round the clock, all weathers, day and night, and the pilots didn't have sufficient experience. The hard facts were. And we, after a while, we found that the loss rate was getting so high that we had to put second tour pilots only on such operations, bad weather and night operations, until they'd done a certain number of deck landing experience, and then they could handle it. But it was calling on a great deal on a small British carrier to land a thing like a Sea Vixen at night in very dark night with the closing speeds that we had. And so it was a very unhappy period. When I say unhappy, I don't think morale was ever that low, but it was something that in retrospect was regrettable, and we overcame it through proper training and laying down limits.
But the new jet aircraft were becoming larger, heavier, and faster. Launching aircraft and landing them back on deck was becoming increasingly more hazardous, particularly on the smaller British carriers. Various attempts were made at solving the problem of launching, including the use of rockets. But the greatest step forward came in 1952 with the introduction of the steam catapult. This British invention harnessed steam power from the carrier's boilers and was to become standard equipment on all carriers. The problem of landing was solved by another British invention, the angled deck. The US Navy was quick to spot the potential of this idea, and in 1952, trials were begun using the USS Antietam. The introduction of the angled deck did away with the need for barriers and the risk of ploughing into parked aircraft, which would prevent other aircraft from landing whilst the wreckage was cleared away. It also enabled carriers to step up their combat readiness, as aircraft could be launched and retrieved simultaneously. The third British invention was the mirror landing site.
The need to fly an accurate 3-degree glide slope to put your tailhook into the wires was getting pressing, because with the old batsman system, by the time the batsman had realized an aircraft was off the glide slope, signaled with his bats, and the pilot had interpreted those signals, it was going to be too late for a correction to be effective. Commander Goodhart in the Naval Air Division discussed the problem with some of his chums, and one of them flippantly said, well, perhaps the solution has got to be mirrors. And immediately he thought, well, a mirror's not such a bad idea. And from those discussions came the idea of the mirror landing site, which I'm about to demonstrate to you in a fairly low-tech, but I hope effective way. With it, I have a mirror, some paper, and a source light. It's said that when the team got back from the pub, they borrowed a powder compact and a lipstick, and they used that for the first ever trial on a desktop. So we have a desktop as well. The idea is to set up a datum line, which I've done with a felt tip pen. You then set the mirror on roughly a 3-degree glide slope, or 3 degrees off the vertical, produce a source. In this case, I'm using the shiny reflection on the top of torch, and I'm going to put that where I see it in line with that datum. I want you to imagine now I'm an aircraft turning finals on a carrier, and my aim is to put the reflection on the top of this torch lined up with the 2 black lines. I can see now that I'm high, the reflection's above my black line. If I move down, I'm on the glide slope. If I move down here, I'm low, and if I continue to approach here, I could strike the sea. But I'm going to put myself on the glide slope. I fly down the slope like this, and my chin hits neatly in the target wires, just short. In a nutshell, that's still the system that's in use today. Obviously, they had to make a production system out of it, and they started with burnished metal, then curved mirrors. They used more than one source light in case of power failure or a broken bulb took away one source light, and in the end, 4 source lights of different power supplies were used. But by the late 1950s, it seemed a good idea to replace the mirror altogether, because projected light would be better than reflected light, and the British designed a new projector sight, still using the same principle, still the same system, but using a stack of 12 vertical projectors to put a meatball in the center. What the pilot sees is exactly the same. Still in use today in every carrier navy in the world. And a similar system is used to bring Sea Harriers back to Invincible, Ark Royal and Illustrious.
Another significant development was the redeployment of aircraft carriers in the amphibious assault role. The introduction of the helicopter meant that Marines could be airlifted from the carrier deck straight into the heart of the action. The effectiveness of this tactic during the Suez Crisis led to Bulwark being redeployed as a dedicated commando carrier equipped with the Westland Wessex. The Wessex utility meant that it was used in many other roles, including air-sea rescue and anti-submarine warfare, both vital in maintaining carrier operations. In 1958, the Fleet Air Arm received its most powerful aircraft to date, the Blackburn Buccaneer. It was designed to meet an Admiralty specification for a supersonic strike aircraft, a role in which it was to prove extremely capable.
Now the Buccaneer, when it was designed and built, the only thing that they could put into it, the only engine that was suitable was the Gyron Junior. And that engine was relatively low powered. The saying goes is that to first trip in the Buccaneer, you get on the end of the runway, you open up full throttle, let the brakes off, and then open up the pilot's notes to see what you do next. And by which time it might be ready to take off. So now that's unkind, that, because the Buccaneer takeoff was very similar to a Hunter with full drops on. And then after it was airborne, then it was away like a rabbit up a drain track, because it was a fantastic low-level airplane, steady, stable, and comfortable, and delight to fly. Light ailerons, light stick. Well, once again, it's all properly harmonized.
Well, it gave him a nuclear capability, if necessary. It had the capability of being able to deliver a nuclear weapon, but so that put it into the next generation, if you like. It could also use, it didn't have guns, it had rockets and that sort of thing instead. But it really was a force multiplier, if you like, and a lovely aeroplane.
We had the Buccaneer Mark I embark for the first time inboard Victorious, and because we were sailed without working up in the ship had just come out of long refit, and the Buccaneer and Vixen squadrons embarked, and we were supposed to work up in the southwestern approaches of the UK, but Ark Royal broke down in the Far East, and we had to be sent straight out to relieve them. So we did our work up off Aden on the way, when temperatures were very high and winds were very light or non-existent. And it posed a real problem with the Buccaneer Mark I because it was grossly underpowered with Gyron Junior engines, and its performance launching off the catapult was marginal. And many is the time we've seen the aircraft disappear from sight and spray coming up from the sea before it finally lumbered into sight. No, it was a hairy time, that, but it was, the Mark I was difficult to operate off the deck, but it was overcome by good training and very good skills and good leadership. And the Mark II was a different cup of tea. It had a different engine altogether, much more powerful engine, and didn't have these close limitations on takeoff and landing, which the Mark I did have.
042. Selected. Roger.
The Buccaneer was joined in service by one of the most potent and versatile combat aircraft ever built, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom.
The Phantom came into service in 1970, into frontline service, and we actually got the first Phantoms at Yeovilton in 1969. So what we had bought was a variant of the United States Naval F-4 Phantom, and we got the K model. And the difference, the principal difference between the UK's K model and the F-4J was the fact that we had Rolls-Royce engines in the aircraft, and we had a Ferranti radar system. And introduction of the new engines meant that there was quite a big redesign of the whole inlet, engine intake, and fitting of the engines. And another major difference was the fact that the nose leg and our Phantoms extended a second time for the launch. So you were actually canted up at, I think, 9 degrees or thereabouts, actually on the catapult. The Phantom was certainly felt as like a later generation aircraft to fly. Technology involved in it was more modern. It was much faster. It was acceleration times was much greater, and it was a hugely more capable aircraft than the Sea Vixen it had replaced. The only comment or criticism one would have of the Phantom was that it was landing that much faster than the Sea Vixen, and the limitations on the aircraft for operations from the deck were certainly not really a step forward. We were quite constrained in terms of deck movement with the Phantom, and this of course led on eventually to the Sea Harrier, where those constraints totally disappeared. The seating configuration of the Phantom was tandem seating, so the pilot in front and the observer behind, and the observer had a pretty good all-round lookout capability. And this was a huge advantage in terms of any air combat, because in the Sea Vixen, the observer was tucked away in what used to be known as the coal hole, the right-hand side of the airplane, with only a very small window. And a lot of observers flew, I think, with the curtains drawn, so they were in their black hole and didn't see out at all. Whereas in the Phantom, the observer could play a huge part in the lookout and in any sort of close combat situation. That was very much a huge advantage, and the observer could call the positions of other aircraft. And this required practice, but it was a huge advantage.
The combination of Buccaneers and Phantoms meant that the Royal Navy's carriers were at the height of their striking power.
I think teamwork comes at the top of the tree on any carrier operation, and to see a worked-up carrier, whether it was back in the piston days or in the jet era or whatever, whether it's American or British, to see a worked-up carrier is a joy for an aviator to behold. The teamwork is absolutely amazing. The little multicoloured men on the flight deck, dressed in different colours to mean different things, with different tasks, all dashing hither and hither with their own specific job, and the noise and the steam and activity. Everywhere you look, with things going on at great pace, and the aircraft being launched and being recovered, and to get them to that state, it takes time. It takes weeks of proper work-up and teamwork and understanding. And that's what you're aiming for, to get aircraft landing on every 30 seconds, being launched every 30 seconds, everything being struck down into the hangar, quickly out of sight, and the next one up, and so on. And everyone with their place. And it does take a lot of working out.